Okay, as a start, could you please say and spell your name?
My name's Thomas Dyja, D-Y-J-A.
Okay. And if you could just give me a brief autobiographical sketch. You can be as elaborate as you'd like. Where you're from, where you've been, what you've done, what you're doing now.
Okay. I was born on the northwest side of Chicago, kind of factory, ethnic Polish neighborhood. Went to Catholic schools there through high school, and then came to New York and went to Columbia College for college. And all through that time, starting in high school, I'd been in the book business, working in bookstores in Chicago. And in college, it was kind of I worked at a place called the Madison Avenue Bookshop on the Upper East Side, which was kind of my other education. It was a great period when the Reagan was in office and all these Upper East Siders were kind of blossoming out, and at the same time the whole Lower East Side scene was going on. So it was a really interesting group of people I was working with who had their toes in all these places. So I was going to Columbia and I had some classes with Edward Said, which was kind of the highlight of my college experience, I think. So it was a really exciting time to be in New York, and it was, I think, I would say that pre-AIDS, really the last great moment of Manhattan, when artists could still afford to live in Manhattan and create, and had movements that were generated. The whole Lower East Side thing, I think, was really the last kind of artistic moment in Manhattan. After that, I was involved in Charles Portis, the guy who wrote Dog of the South and True Grit, had written a book that we all loved at the store called Dog of the South, and we would read it to each other, ignore people in the store to read it to me. And when I was a senior, I found out, looking through Random House catalog or Knopf, that they were remaindering it all. So I said, we should buy it. They had 200 copies left. So we ended up doing a window of the book. And this got a lot of attention, New Yorker articles written about it. And his agent came in one Saturday and said, "Oh, this is terrific. Charlie started writing again," all this stuff. So it kind of put some air back under his career, really, which had stalled. He was living in a trailer behind a post office in Little Rock or something like that. So he started writing again, and when I graduated, I sent a letter to his agent, Lynn Nesbitt, who was at ICM, and she hired me to work there. So I started reading manuscripts up in the movie department, then became an assistant, and then I moved to Boston to follow an affair of the heart for a while, then came back to New York as an assistant editor at Bantam, so I was in the book business from there. And then I was a freelance editor for a while. I was a partner in a book packaging company, which is kind of like an architect contractor in the book world. You're a producer, basically. You hire all the pieces, the writers, the editors, the designers, and sort of create stuff. So we had clients like ESPN and the Figure Skating Association and People Magazine and stuff. And somewhere along the way I started to write. There was a period when I was, how should we say, underemployed. And what I always really wanted to do was write. And I had felt that I really hadn't done enough to write fiction in a way. I really did understand, having sold books and edited them, that if you don't have anything to actually say or haven't done anything, writing is a kind of,
it doesn't matter
a little masturbatory, it's a little boring. So I wrote that first 100 pages in my great Bildungsroman, and I read it, and I was bored, and it was my life. I thought this was not a good sign for the marketplace. So I kind of focused on the other stuff. But there was a window that I had to start. I just felt it was a gift, and I did it. And I came across an idea. I read something that there were a series of baseball games between the North and South during the Civil War, and there was just evidence of it happening somehow. And that just seemed to me to be a perfect, like it was a John Ford movie, waiting to be made. So I dove into that and really kind of started from scratch in researching the Civil War, and took a few years, but it ended up my first novel, which went to 25 publishers, and the day I said, okay, I'm going to put it in the bottom drawer and start the next one. I really enjoyed doing this, and it was really important for me. It was bought by Harcourt, and so, the rest is not history with a capital H. At least it happened, right? So, but it did well. It was in Discover, Barnes and Noble thing, and it got optioned for the movies and stuff. So at the same time I was doing other packaging stuff, I was writing fiction. So I've written 3 novels. The second one was about a guy who becomes a Civil War reenactor and starts to believe that the person's coming back to take over his life in very positive and negative ways. Kind of a ghost story, turn-of-the-century ghost story. The third one was based on the life of Walter White, who was head of the NAACP for about 20 years, and he was blonde, blue-eyed, really only fractionally black, but very controversial guy, as I found out. But the book was really an attempt to take... When he was young, he would go, because he was blonde and blue-eyed, when there were lynchings in the teens and early 20s, he would go south, down to these little towns in the South, posed as a journalist or sometimes a traveling salesman, hang around just long enough to get the story, and then get out before he got lynched. So he had a couple of really great close calls that I whipped into a kind of film noir that was never made into a film noir. But then I did a short biography of him, and then the book I have coming out next year is a cultural history of post-war Chicago, which are called The Third Coast, which kind of wraps this whole period from the late 30s through 1960 or so, which I think is it's almost an alternate history of America, told from the Midwest instead of all the major movements out of the East. There really were important things happening in Chicago that I would argue had an even deeper impact on what America is and how it sees itself and how the rest of the world sees it, from rock and roll to McDonald's to Mies van der Rohe and glass steel architecture. All these things come out of Chicago, much more so than New York, which actually follows them in many of these cases. So that's the bio.
So you've done an awful lot of writing, and you're still doing an awful lot of writing, but are you still in other ends of the book business at this point? Or
Yeah, actually I am. I did a book recently. I packaged a book about the High Line, which was really exciting, and I think one of the most beautiful things I've had a hand in. The High Line is that terrific old railroad track, kind of elevated railroad track that starts around Gansevoort Street, goes up to like the Javits Center in the low 30s. And Giuliani, one of the last things he tried to do was get it torn down. But happily, a couple guys down in that community district, Robert Hanman and Josh David, who were really devoted to Jane Jacobs and those kind of ideas of urbanism, and they pushed really hard to have it turned into something else, turned into a park. And it is now the biggest tourist attraction in New York City. More than 3 million people a year are kind of piling into this little strip of railroad. But when I first went up there a few years ago, it was a kind of revelation, because it somehow, being up 30 feet in the air, kind of aestheticized everything that you did, or at least I did. You'd look at these tops of buildings and say, wow, look at that top of a building. What a beautiful, look at the brickwork. It just changed how you looked at everything. And so for me, the whole place was kind of a performance art stage for you, the viewer, to just live this kind of activated way of seeing, which is terrific, instant karma in a way. So my old business partner became publisher of Thames and Hudson, and I sat down and said, well, gee, what can we do together? And at the time, there was nothing about the High Line, and I just thought what there should be would be a visual book.
So this is photographs with some commentary?
Yeah, the text is written by this wonderful writer named Anik Lafarge, who lives on the High Line, and it's a deeper history of it in context. I mean, there are other books about how it was made, which is a great story about urban planning and for that Jane Jacobs world, how you wrestle with the New York establishment and business establishment to make something like that happen. But this is a book about the High Line in its historical context and what New York was and what it's becoming, and kind of the things that have happened along there, which are everything from part of the Manhattan Project. They were storing uranium in one of those big warehouses along there, to the meatpacking district, which was a pretty hardcore Loesch area in the not distant memory. So there's a lot of, it's about that whole area, and not just that, but also the gardening of it, which is fascinating, and the architecture of it. But it's a guide to it. We were hoping that every German and French tourist who comes will buy it, But and also the community, which has had, I think, its own issues with the High Line. Having 3 million people suddenly descending onto your neighborhood has caused a lot of stressors, I think, for Chelsea. And the art community, I think, has been kind of overlooked. It would not have happened without the art community, which had moved there from Soho to take up these big spaces in Chelsea, and they laid the groundwork. It would not have been able to happen without them. So we tried to do a book that really encompassed that as part of the whole High Line art experience, was the art world that's down there. So it's a visual book with 400 plus photos and people we got off the internet, which is exciting, who were just really eager to get images into books. So it was very, at a moment when everybody is talking about the book business getting, so terrible and anachronistic. These were people whose work was online, who were thrilled and excited and felt that they had kind of reached a high point by having it in a book. And I think, to me, that kind of vindicated publishing, let me know that, or at least, made me think that it will always exist. Books that something I've given my life to since I was 16, they're not going away.
Right. So going forward, you expect to continue both writing and participating in the business in other ways?
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually becoming a consulting editor at Thames and Hudson, and bringing in book ideas there, and working in. I really do enjoy working in visual books, which I haven't done. The books I've done in the past have been more text-based and, kind of brand-based. When I was a packager, we'd sit down with NASCAR and say, what kind of book can we do about NASCAR, So being able to work with art is a great joy. Even just doing the photo insert for the Chicago book I'm kind of curating it. It's going to be the best damn photo insert anyone's ever seen. I've hunted down this guy who took pictures of Henry Darger's apartment after he left, so it's basically like Henry Darger has died and they went upstairs and took photos. They're just knockout pictures. I found, digging through the 12,000 photos that say Chicago in the Library of Congress digital collection, there is a photo of Inez Stark, who was this socialite who held a poetry circle at the Southside Community Arts Center, which is a very influential, it's the last WPA project that still is operating, but Gwendolyn Brooks and a number of other really important poets from the Black Renaissance were in her poetry circle, and it's this throwaway photo of it with no names of anything. I was like, it was a great. I haven't seen in any other books. I've got it. So, being able to do things visually, and I think kind of the joy of doing that other editing stuff. So it's another kind of piece of my head there, and it's fun to get back into the business in a way, in a business sense, since I've been really just writing away for a while. To get back in working in publishing at this time is kind of odd but wonderful.
So I want to there are a few things I want to follow up on, but let's go way back to Chicago, to your childhood. Can you talk more about, first of all, where did your parents come from? What was your deeper family background? And then can you describe the neighborhood that you were growing up in, and maybe from both the perspective of that little boy who was growing up in that neighborhood, but now also as a historian of Chicago.
Right,
can you kind of reflect on it in both dimensions?
Well, it was a mixed family, mixed marriage. My mother's from the south side, my father's from the north side, which is kind of, these were two worlds that didn't really, match up. It was 2500 north, way west, so Fullerton Central. It's kind of, it was that ring beyond where the kind of all the ethnic ghettos were. There were large stretches of kind of bungalows and two flats and things like that. But this is where the next generation went to. My father's side had come from Poland in the late teens, early 20s, Krakow area mostly. My grandfather worked at Chicago Faucet his whole life, making pipes and drinking beer were, I think, the two major activities, and letting his very large, overbearing wife, my grandmother Josephine, who I happily never met, kind of browbeat him. And then my mother's side were from Germany and Hungary. My grandfather had worked in, on the killing floor in some slaughterhouses in Cleveland, was a bartender, and then ended up as a waiter in Chicago at the Edgewater Beach Hotel, which was the posh north side kind of resort. It was on the lake, and it was really the place. So he did events there, and he was a waiter for a while at the Windermere, which is by University of Chicago. So he was a waiter. My grandmother was Hungarian and a homemaker. And he had built their house, which we recently sold. My aunt died, and it was one of the first homes in Evergreen Park. So we have pictures from the 30s of it being the only structure around with prairie for miles around. So in a certain way, we kind of are real, still, no one ran out to the suburbs. My mom still lives in the house on the northwest side. It was a very, like many people say about Chicago at the time, and I think it's a kind of weird antebellum sense, because race was such a big topic that one always, there's a kind of romanticizing of the period that to me, just always echoes the way people write about pre-Civil War South. It was innocent. The children ran through the streets, and the Mr. Softy would come, and we all rode our bikes, which was true all over the country, but which doesn't mean it didn't happen, because there was a great sense of security. But a lot of it was in retrospect, I mean, there were remarkable, horrible stories going on all the time of children being kidnapped. It's sort of a weird trope in Chicago of child abduction and molestation and murder that you see all the time, and it kind of ends up in my book, it kind of crests with these two horrible murders of Emmett Till, but also these boys on the Northwest Side in this neighborhood not far from where I grew up, which was supposed to be where you ran away to be safe. You went out to this neighborhood, which was 100% white and Polish and German, and everybody was Catholic, and it was safe. And these kids were stolen off the street, and the crime was never solved, but their bodies were found tossed naked into a ditch and shown on the news. The TV cameras went and showed their... Now, in 2012, they pixelate out the stuff. This was 1955, and they showed everything. It was just galling. And that kind of undercurrent of danger and of something really ugly was there all the time, but it's denied. Now we look back, and it was this magical period of, playing cops and robbers and stuff on the street. So, but on another way, it was all Catholic, or at least in the way it was presented. The city was probably 2/3 Catholic. The idea that there were Jews there was surprising, except I did as a kid watch on Sunday mornings. There was a show called The Magic Door, which featured this little acorn on the ground, and out jumped Tiny Tove, who was dressed in a little kind of Exodus outfit, a little hat, and he had a guitar, and he was playing sort of kibbutzim songs, And to me, Catholic, my mother taught Catholic school for 40 plus years. We were really darn Catholic, and I was just fascinated with this show. He would sing a little song, and then he would jump into the acorn and go down to Toraville, and he would hang out with a set of puppets, including Booby Beaver, who was a kind of every beaver character, and Judy Bunny, who was this jappy, she had big pearls on it, Rumpelmeyer the dragon, and I was just fascinated, and my mother I wanted to become a citizen at Toraville, and she said, that's fine, I guess, But what puzzled me the most was at Christmas time, when every other... I was waiting for the Christmas show of The Magic Door. What will they do? And it wasn't there. It was this thing with candles, and you're like, what? That was kind of a loss for me. But so that was the only sense I ever had. That, and we would have bagels on Sunday, but the only sense that there actually were Jews there. So it was anything but diverse. It was a very working class neighborhood, and what I see now were the different levels of acculturation going on. Where we lived, there was a Catholic school on the corner of St. James, they had a Polish school, the masses were in Polish. It was one of those Catholic parishes that was trying to retain a national identity. And the overall archdiocese was trying to break that down and create kind of one uniform archdiocese, but you had Polish, German, different things that retained the language, retained a lot of stuff. And my father was adamant that we did not go to Polish school. We never learned Polish. He aggressively kept us away from that stuff, which is a little sad that I never learned that culture. But on the other hand, ultimately he was right. I think it was that middle class. Moving up the ladder thing.
Well, which brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask about, which is, so you end up coming to New York to go to college. How does that happen? First of all, I mean, what's the story behind that decision?
How I went,
but also, as that 18 or 19-year-old, what was the future that you thought you were heading into at that point?
Right.
Did you have? Right. Did the thing about books just happen along the way, or was that already an interest of yours, or what did you think you were going to do?
I was sort of precocious in certain ways. I was going to the theater in high school, and I saw the first preview of Studs Terkel's Working, and I met him there. He was sitting behind me. I thought that was kind of great. I saw the one performance of David Mamet's one musical, Lost Canoe, based on Father Marquette. It was terrible. It was absolutely, they apologized afterwards at how bad it was. But so I like doing that stuff. And I would go downtown on the L by myself. I used to cut school. And I remember buying just very much one day that kind of was maybe the moment that put me on the path. I went and bought Carl Sandburg's collected poems at Crocs at Brentano's on Wombat Street and walked to the pier going out to the Adler Planetarium and sat and read Sandburg and just thought, this is men's work. This is writing it can be a sweaty, hard thing. And that was sort of the moment when I fell for it. And I was an intense, and remain in certain ways, an intense chauvinist about Chicago. I mean, I just loved the place. And it did then at that time really inculcate it was Franco's Spain. I mean, these are the daily years. And so it was a little bit like being this insulated little capital, inside. And, but I loved it. Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, Hemingway. It was just all terrific, and I wanted to be a part of that. And in high school, I was editor of the yearbook and did all that kind of stuff. And we had a terrific English department at this school, Gordon Tech, and one of the teachers who was the moderator of the yearbook and stuff would take the newspaper kids and the yearbook staff to the Columbia Press Convention at Columbia University every spring. There's a week during the break when they have a high school press convention. So we would go to that, take the train, go stay at hotels, and the first time I came, all set, New York. Oh, we hate New York, and I just walked from Columbia to the hotel on 42nd by UN and just felt liberated in a way that I never had before. Mm-hmm. All these things that were just so knit into everyday life in Chicago, and even about race. It was like, God, no one, it's not, I mean, of course it is, and I, lived here long enough to know it is, but in a very different way, and people are just so more woven together in New York, and the freedom of no one really caring what you were doing. Even in Chicago, that you'd still get looks. People were still checking you out about who you were, why you're there. And it didn't happen in New York, and it was just such a rush. And I just thought, I might need to come here. So college ended up being a choice between Columbia and University of Chicago. And sadly, one of the major was either staying in Chicago, going to a school with a fabulous, amazing academic tradition, and really the most dismal social reputation in the world. Drinking age was 21 in Chicago. I'd be living at home in my bedroom, or move to New York, go to Columbia, and where it was 18, and sort of start all over again. And I'd actually gone to I took a couple classes at a Harvard summer school. Like, I'd saved up money and just to see what it was like to not live at home, and that was pretty excellent, not living at home at that age. So it was kind of decided. I got into Columbia, and a very good friend of mine got it as well, and we. But the other part of it really was I wanted to go into the book business somewhere. I had been working at a bookstore on the Northwest Side in a mall, and had gotten to know people in management there. The guy who was running the bookstore had been a very good, he ran a newsstand in the Loop. And so they gave him this bookstore as kind of a gift to kind of keep him out. It was like a promotion. He couldn't hurt anybody, He's the kind of guy who would, his way of making friends would stand next to you and fart and then look at you and say, hey, what do you, in front of other people. So he was a kind of, but he knew that I wanted to do other stuff. And I had, actually, a bookstore, they had given you a test. You had to fill out a test of 100 titles, and you had to put the name of the author or the section where it would go into. This is unthinkable now. Imagine Barnes and Noble asking, right? So, and I had done extremely well on this, and people were coming to management. Who the hell is this 16-year-old who could do this? So, some of those people were really, really helpful in getting me a job in New York and kind of pointing me towards going into the business in some way. And so I actually am. Things that I have today, I really can point back to help and direction that I got as a teenager, the junior in high school. So I think book publishing was always the other thing I wanted to do. I mean, balancing both really, I guess, was ultimately a kind of goal.
So one of the other questions I had, you wrote 2 novels that in different ways had to do with the Civil War.
Yeah. And
what years were these that you were working on these books?
I guess late, mid-90s would have been Play for a Kingdom, which is the baseball Civil War one. because it was right. You know, one of the reasons why I felt I could do it is that we didn't have any kids yet. And so it was a kind of open, this, if I'm ever to take a header, this is when to do it. And so I literally sold it. I don't know if our son was born yet, but it was kind of right. It was there. I kind of got in under the wire on that one. And then the second one was like 98, 99, because it really takes place. It's like around 2001, because it's about that period, millennial panic kind of feeds into it. And that was a weird moment of almost America didn't quite know what to do with itself, I think.
And we do now.
Well, no, but I mean, we have direction. It's not necessarily good, but it was that, you know, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and it was that Fukuyama end of history moment, you know, and 2000 was coming, and we didn't quite know where we were going. And so a lot of what the book is about, these people going back, I mean, this was that when Tony Horwitz wrote Confederates in the Attic was around this time. People were really trying to find direction by going back into the past, you know, and maybe some really messed up
ways,
I
was curious. Did you end up spending time with reenactors? Can you talk about that? Like,
I hooked up with, because the first novel was about this regiment, the 14th Brooklyn. So I figured I'd met some of those guys researching that novel, and they provided then, and I haven't kept up with the reenacting world in the same way, but they were a kind of vernacular history source. I mean, these guys were doing individual research on each person. They would be assigned a person to portray, and they would each do individual research as far as going back to England to find their ancestors of the person they were reenacting. So they're kind of throwaway if you're into an all, you know, here's what this person did on this day. They were going crazy on it, and it was fascinating. What they were doing with it necessarily was, you know, becoming Confederate reenactors and twisting some of the history is one thing, but they were kind of all really avid amateur historians and living it out in an interesting way. So I went back to them. I was just fascinated. There had been someone who had been shot at a big reenactment. I think it was Gettysburg. Someone had loaded a real bullet and killed someone and shot him in the head. And I thought, wow, there's something that's kind of blurring of reality and not, you know, of what's real and what's not. When I was doing the publicity, I did a radio thing, and I went out and interviewed some people, and I sat down with this woman and her husband who were just really good reenactors. You know, they had it down, and they just felt totally comfortable. And I said, so it's Monday, you know, it's Monday morning, you're done with that weekend, you know, what are you thinking about all week? And she said, I'm thinking about what I'm going to do this weekend, what I'm going to cook, how, you know, what am I going to do this weekend as a reenactor? And it struck me that her real life, she really was that person on the weekends. That was who she wanted to be. That was her best self, was this woman dressed up in 1860s garb, you know, living this other life. And so that kind of sprung out to me, the idea of this, somebody who really starts to blur what's real, and maybe he's a better person at that other time when he's being 18. Right? Yeah, I mean, maybe he's a better guy, you know, and that's who he should be in his
So is there a reenacting type? Or do you just find all kinds of people in these settings?
Well, one thing I thought was interesting was people fell into they didn't really play people that they weren't. You know, the guy who led the regiment when I was dealing with him was a bank vice president. And he was exactly the kind of guy who would start a regiment in the Civil War. And the guys who were the lower level guys were kind of lower level guys in real life. You didn't have a guy who was a shoe repair guy running a regiment. It didn't happen. They kind of fell into their regular hierarchy in a certain way. They were all history buffs were what really drove it. You know, I wouldn't say they were all. Probably more preponderance were to the right of the schedule, but not to a scary degree. When you got south, then it is. You know, there aren't many liberal Civil War reenactors in the South, so they actually have to work. If you do both, it's a big plus, because there are limits sometimes on how many people could do them, and this was 10, 15 years ago, but they would pay bounties to people to dress up as Union soldiers because everybody wants to be a Confederate, and having gone to some, it was, you'd kind of go over a hill, and then there would be the whole settlement of all the people, and it was fascinating, and you could just kind of sink into this whole other world where there were no cell phones. This is when cell phones were just starting,
right.
And nothing electronic. And there was one, I forget, someplace in Virginia, and it was dusk, and everyone's walking around in their period clothes, and then a guy comes by on a white horse, long hair and a beard, and the horse just comes galloping by, and it was just like, oh, that's so beautiful, and I understood why you would do this, because it was just a suspension of reality, and it was so romantic and fabulous, and I think at that period politically, for a lot of those people with the kind of Pax Clintonia that had become through, I think there was this sense of we've lost it all, and it was another kind of way of grabbing back that antebellum past, and I think...
Which is, to parse it out, how much of it is the kind of sectional politics of it, and how much of it is the kind of anti-modernism of it?
It's hard to kind of assign amount. I think the politics is almost... It's hard for a lot of people to really express nuanced political thought. A lot of it's emotional, and I think this is a way to express what they felt and what they thought but couldn't necessarily put words on, the way that psychotherapy is really just a way to help you put words on stuff, and I think reenacting helped a lot of people wrap themselves around how they felt, and so the anti-modernism part is, it wasn't just a Luddite thing, because these people had cell phones. They had all these things. They really weren't back to nature people. If they were seriously anti-modern, there were a lot of options for living that way, and they weren't. These are people actively in the world. So I think that there was that element to it. I met some people who were Revolutionary War reenactors, and they were a whole other breed.
Well, that's I guess kind of what I was thinking about when I asked the politics question, because then there's like this whole Renaissance fair kind of thing too, and you can imagine that those folks would have some things to talk about with Civil War reenactors, but maybe not that much.
But exactly. Because they're not there, and they don't get to that level of. There was that whole almost religious question of authenticity, where people really were counting, and I don't know if it is still at that level, because I did check out because it's kind of nuts, but where they were counting thread counts, because the factory in Fredericksburg that was making these coats didn't have enough needles, and so if you have 14 stitches on your pocket and not 12, it's not, and historically there is something fascinating about that, and I love the kind of tactile nature, and the fiction I've written that was historical, and even the nonfiction, I want to really express the time, not by saying here's the time, but here's how it smelt and here's how it tasted. That's good fiction, and I think good nonfiction and good history. And so they were doing that, but it did become, I can only say religious. There were and then there were the people who would show up with a keg of beer and with their Union jacket on or whatever, and sort of play with guns. And there was something a little dissolute about that. It was just they could have been fishing, but they decided to do this instead, and you'd kind of lean towards the more hardcore people, even though they were sincerely much more crazy. But yeah, the Renaissance fair people, obviously, you'd have to be researching stuff in cloisters in France to be able to get the level of authenticity, and that's more, I think, about just holding really big turkey legs and bosomy wenches and things like that. But you kind of see it now really being mainstreamed in something like there's that show, I don't know if you saw it, Full Metal Jousting.
No.
Totally watchable. They have these two teams of guys who joust. They fit them up in pretty high-tech jousting stuff, but big horses and it's great. It's really great to watch.
Okay. So, you mentioned Tony Horwitz's book, Confederates in the Attic, which is, of course, devoted to the what he calls the unfinished Civil War, which, obviously is something that we are living with and that you have thought a lot about. So kind of to take what you were just talking about your intersection with the reenactors world and Horwitz's argument about the ways in which the sectional rivalry and all the baggage that goes along with that, including the racial baggage, is still very much alive in America. I mean, he's writing in the 1990s, but we can surely see that that's still the case now.
The North lost, yeah.
So I mean, how do the Obama years look in those terms to you? Kind of thinking about this paradigm of the ongoing Civil War, because, I mean, clearly, the day he won the election, there were an awful lot of people who just wanted to say, now, at last, it's over, right? We've arrived someplace that we've never been before.
Right, which we had.
So, well, it's yes and no. So I guess...
Yeah, I mean, like everything else, yes and no. But I think what the right really took the politics of victimhood to a new level. I think it had always been there, and I think it became the mainstream. I mean, it's all this sense of victimization has become the whole point of politics. We're being victimized by taxes. We're being victimized by all these things that are that come from a place that is anything but. It's so. I think the South did fundamentally win because that mindset appealed to some very base things, and I think a politics of fear and greed they're not even hidden behind anything at this point, and I think it's shocking and sad. I think and Obama was I think a close reading of his record would give you, these years ended up not being that much of a surprise if you were really paying attention to what he was saying, which was not ever, hi, I'm a socialist. He was really anything but a socialist, So the surprises, I think, for those of us, and I will proudly say that I'm on the left, it's been a little bit surprising to people. I think we're expecting more out of him. And it's somewhat not surprising if you were really watching what was going on. Mm-hmm. So I think fundamentally a lot of the impulses of the left that put him in place were hung out to dry, I think, because that sense of making peace and trying to be Abraham Lincoln and Nelson Mandela and winning the Nobel Peace Prize without really actually doing all that much, all of that was talking about compromise. And when you're dealing with people, they don't want compromise. They wanted. I think that victimhood, that mindset, was not about compromise. And I think we've gotten to this place that is very binary. I think we are ruled by numbers now in a way that we just never were 20, 30 years ago. We're kind of following our technology, I think, and trying to emulate the way our machines work, and I don't think it's a good thing. So that backroom politics and smoke-filled rooms, which were so, which we all hated when we were younger, it's dirty, transparency maybe isn't such a good thing. I don't really want to see the ones and zeros that make up my MP3 files. I would like it to be kind of blurry, because reality is blurry, and so I think we have a politics that does not reflect reality at all, people's opinions and what they really want. I mean, it's so up or down, black or white, and getting people to make compromise is impossible. So I think as much as Obama has talked about compromise, I think it has been, I don't think he's brought it to the table in the same way. I don't think it's been a compromise of strength between two sides, and that's been a bit of a disappointment. Mm-hmm. I'm speaking personally, not in some historical.
So what's the way out of that you can imagine? Like, what would have to happen? What would be the preconditions for a different kind of politics? So, for example, we're speaking now just a few days after the Supreme Court decision that upheld the health reform. How important or unimportant is that in terms of building bridges, which people can actually kind of reach each other?
It could be, I think, in time, one of those great votes of conscience. I'd like to think that Robert's vote was a vote of conscience, and even if it was a kind of calculated move to make sure that the Supreme Court maintained its viability and integrity in the face of what it's looked like just completely politicized thing, then it would be a great moment. The question is whether the right in the House and sort of whether they'll really able to make some moves of conscience here, and the left is not without responsibility in this. I think they, litmus tests on abortion. Clinton was able to do as much as he did because he was upfront, safe, legal. What's the available, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. So I mean, it was a place of compromise, and people still feel that way about it, but it was a place of compromise, and the left is certainly not good at compromise either. So we need a few more people to be able to stand up, and who'd have ever thought I'd be the guy to say Roberts is some hero of compromise, but I think he actually has made something important happen by having the guts to do that. Now, if once in a while you get a few more Republicans who say, listen, we actually need, to see the deficits, the debt ceiling. This is how it's done. We need to support those people. But I think one of the problems is that the media cycle is so fast and hard that getting things and ideas like that to take root, the throw weight of things that have to go around it are immense. For really to stand out historically and to kind of gather some fruit around it. So one vote just screws you when you need something else, as opposed to gets covered as something, unless it is that defining 51st vote on something in the Senate or something like that, where all the lights on it. So I can't say I'm terribly optimistic about all of this. I don't think either side is encouraged to compromise in any way, and I don't know where it goes. I don't see it becoming something violent. I don't see us going into a second civil war, only because we're all so comfortable with our stuff. If we were ever going to take to the streets, we've had a lot of opportunities in the last 20 years to grab our pots and ladles and stop traffic and do all that, between the Iraq War and Bush versus Gore, and we've had all kinds of reasons to do it, and we haven't. The recession, the collapse and bailing out everybody except the average Americans, we could have taken to the streets a lot of times, and we haven't. So God only knows what it would take for people to really come up with that sense of communal effort, and to regain some of that sense of society, of community. And it exists all over, all over people do these things, but kind of getting those little groups to form something larger is hard. And I don't think it's aided by television, by computers, by the way we're going, which is much more atomized. So people form communities in the clouds, they form communities of interest, but they're not necessarily communities of action. Now, you can argue that in that world, people all glom together and they, 100 million likes for something, and then make something happen. And maybe that is real, and as I get older, I will wrap my head around that, but somehow I still need to see people stopping things or doing things before it really feels like anybody's worried about it.
What's your expectation for the election?
I think Obama will win a frighteningly close election at the end of the day. I think his biggest challenge is regaining the attention of people who he got to vote for him the first time, and really getting young people to believe in something other than just, hey, I've got a really cool internet reach out thing, I mean, all of that seemed really exciting, and he was reaching to a new generation, but unfortunately the payoff hasn't really been there for people.
How do you understand that? Is that just what is that a function of? Is it a function of the kind of politician he is? Is it a function of strategic decisions his team made the minute he took office? Is it a function of that generation and their own proclivities? I mean, how do you understand?
In the sense of what? The
kind of demobilization of the kind of younger progressive cohort that was just on fire in 2008.
Well, I think the warning shot was Joe Lieberman. I find it amusing that people talk about Obama being a Chicago politician and he's all full of Chicago politics. in Chicago politics, if somebody like Joe Lieberman had stabbed your back the way that he did, he would, at best, not be in politics anymore, and at worst, disappear. And the fact that he compromised and sort of brought him back into the fold under Lieberman's own terms was, I think, an immediate sign of weakness to the right and to the Republicans, who were in complete disarray. And instead of it being a grand gesture, I think it was...
There's blood in the water.
Immediately, I'm going to be this great man. And instead of playing some real politics, kick him out. You think LBJ would have kept Lieberman around? And LBJ managed to enact a great society. The war, yes, but also on the other side of the balance were some enormous achievements that we still hold dear to what America is, and which Obama has done. Obamacare, I'm sorry, is not... It doesn't bring any of the throw weight of some of those things that were done by somebody who is seen as a, tough, nasty, awful guy. But God, he was a great politician. Even if it involved a gun once in a while. But I think he didn't do that, and I think the whole way he dealt with Guantanamo and all that, which I think a lot of people, myself included, were expecting something. We needed to say more than we're not going to do that anymore. We needed to say there's going to be some justice. Someone will have to pay. And taking this kind of South African, where everyone is going to be absolved and we'll all be friends, someone needed to answer for that. It was too horrible of a stain on what we were suddenly responsible for, all of this in our name. And he didn't do that. And that, I think a lot of those things started to erode confidence. We wanted something, we needed a statement that we were back as a moral force again, possibly, hopefully. And, that is, and maybe I'm, still have that little shred of youthful naivete, but that is also the kind of stuff that young voters, I think, care about. As much as the pocket issues and the wallet issues, do I have a job or not? And none of that has come through. I think the economy stabilized. I think he did an amazing job. His best work was between being elected and being inaugurated. He was an enormous stabilizing force, and I think has done well in maintaining that. I think the fact that we are where we are is actually an achievement when you look at Europe.
When you look at Europe and when you look at what he's up against in terms of everything he brings to the table.
So in that sense, I think he's been... he is, in reality, I think, a moderate Republican. When I calibrate my memory of what made a centrist and what made a liberal, he is probably a right centrist or something like that. He's hardly what I would consider a liberal. When you think Harry Truman, his 1947 budget was all about enacting universal single-payer health care. All these ideas that seem completely insane now, or lefty pie-in-the-sky socialism, were pretty mainstream ideas at many other times in our history. And that's one of the things that has brought me and keeps me in history, is to try to explain that these things were a part of what America, not just what America was, but the best aspects of what America was were when we did do things on some concerted level, when we did act together. The WPA, that would have been a really good way to solve some of the crisis. Was that kind of action.
Which to me is the thing that continues always to surprise me about the Tea Party movement, is how government ends up being the villain in this story. When, so many of the Tea Party, they are the WPA Medicare cohort,
right? They
Social Security, Medicare, all these things, and government is the villain in their narrative, which is.
But it's hard to argue it in a rash. I don't mean to. They're all crazy. It's not a thought-based movement.
It's that emotion.
I think
that
it's
you were
really.
These.
I don't know what the Venn diagram of reenactors and Tea Party members would be, but I'm guessing that it might be
right. Well, let's throw
large.
another group in there. I think there is a place where Occupy and the Tea Party come together. They don't literally come together, but they have
do
create
a number
a kind
of common. There are, I think, a surprising number of common goals there in it. And I guess my disappointment with Occupy, talking about reaching out to young people, I think they did a singularly poor job of reaching out to young people, because young people now are not quite as, even though I've just said they are interested in those pie in the sky things, but not for those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s. They are much more realists than I think we ever were, or I'm speaking myself. And Occupy just has never seemed to offer any kind of path, and yelling and saying no is important as a first step, but then you do need to go somewhere. And all of these kinds of kind of peaceful resolutions we've seen that were effective, whether it's Burma, whether it's the Philippines, all these people who kind of changed things through soft revolution, offered some kind of path. They said, let's go here. And what you got in Occupy, as much as you wanted to say no, but what was next, and voting on what kind of shoes you're going to wear and what we're going to have for lunch today, it's not real, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that wasn't going to go anywhere, because you can't all vote on everything, and where are you going to go? So it's a lot of foot stomping, and the Tea Party obviously is, I think, cannier in being able to coalesce around things and put forward people and creating a sort of program which is, let's get rid of all government. Now, it's a really bad program, but
and it's also a heavily funded program.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. And no one is kind of rolled in, but who would roll in and give millions of dollars to Occupy? I mean, people did put a lot of money towards it, but again, look, what direction did it take it in? I don't know, and maybe I'm not paying enough attention, but I haven't seen a directed place where it's gone to. And they needed, this leaderless organization needed leadership. And I don't know that ever emerged in any way to make it a credible force. So, but I do think some of the impulses are very much the same of misuse of public money, and of there being a kind of that military-industrial corporate complex that Eisenhower warned about, and it's hard to say that without sounding like a wacky conspiracy person, but on another level, it is the reality. I don't know how much. I think there is a kind of aristocracy in America now that makes way too many of the decisions that we have no input on. Right. And I find that most distressing. And so the Citizens United stuff, the way the banking all played out, and these are people who are beyond political party. The idea that suddenly Wall Street doesn't like Obama. I mean, the money goes to whoever's going to do the most good for them, and it always hedges on both. Business always gives money to both sides if there's any chance that the other guy's going to get elected. I mean, they hedge their bets, and so it's either 60-40 or 70-30. It's just a matter of how much they hedge, And so now a little more money, the money is tipped away from Obama, but as his poll numbers go up, and if he looks like it'll start to fall to that side as well, I think. So whoever is able to make good for them, or this is the guy they're going to support. That's my, the kids. I have that get off my lawn thing going now. So.
Well, just a couple more questions. So when, as long as we're talking about Wall Street, can you talk a little bit about your experience of, or your kind of experience with maybe the economic crisis, especially being here in New York? I mean, what were the ways? I mean, do you know people who were really affected by it? What were the ways that it became manifest, in between 2008 and now? And
well, I'm lucky enough to say that we were not, as a family, severely hurt by it. My wife is also in publishing, and we came through not severely dinged by it. I think Manhattan as a whole rises and falls in a lot of ways now on the financial community. So in our school, there were some families that were pretty high up on the ladder who found themselves looking for financial aid and things like that. But you could see it in kind of tactile ways in that community. I think was the place I saw a lot of it. And when my son was at bar mitzvah year, there were some pretty remarkably obscene celebrations. You know, getting up into seven figures for these kids turning 12 and 13, and that was kind of, I'm trying to do the math, but late, you know, that was before the crash. And my daughter, who's 4 years younger, was after that, and it was very different. You know, there were still a lot of people who they were of the group who did not lose a lot of money, and some of them actually profited quite handsomely from it, and it played the other side. But that kind of euphoria, there was a scary euphoria before the crash, and I think I wasn't financially savvy enough to put all my money in the other place, but you just knew it couldn't keep going like this. People couldn't keep buying and consuming and getting this crazy on it, and it kind of fell out. And so in my daughter's year, when she had this same circle of parties, they were much more understated. I mean, there was still a lot of money flying around, but it wasn't on display in the same way, you know. And I think that has been one of the longer term. I think people have kind of calmed down a bit. It's not quite as disgusting as it was.
So you think that's less about available resources and more about a different sense of decency?
A little bit, or at least trying not to show off because you might be jumped. No, but I mean, a little bit of that. I think that the race to the top has kind of calmed down a little bit, because I think the people who, my sense of what happened is that that 4% that became unemployed, that money was sucked away to maintain share value. You know, the stock market is back up, you know, getting up 12,500, 13,000, and that happened because the people that live in my neighborhood were able to keep their jobs, and they took all the money off the table, you know, and killed fluidity. And so until some of that flows back out there, maybe we need more disgusting bar mitzvahs now to sort of spread some of the money. So you're calling it kind of personal stimulus. But it's a kind of weird circle, because that amount of consumption was actually fueling some of the growth. So the year when nobody spent any money on Christmas was exactly the year that people needed to spend money on Christmas. And so people who had the money weren't spending it, and it was this kind of weird contrary circle, you know. I mean, people I know who live uptown have had a much more painful experience. You know, Harlem is a different place than the Upper West Side of Manhattan where I live, you know, which I think came through fine and dandy. But Harlem, Washington Heights, unemployment there much higher, schools in a much more dismal shape than they were before. And how do we link those two things together? You know, I don't know. Bloomberg's done a lot of great stuff, but I don't think he has been able to merge our interests in as much as he could have. So.
Well, thank you so much. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel that we should have?
I think this will do for now.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.